Thanks very much for joining us today for this online event on diversity among peacekeepers, who is involved in UN peace support operations and how does it matter. My name is Charlie de Rivers. I'm the Research Fund and Uptake Director for the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Programme, also known as XCEPT. Before we kick off today's discussion, a quick bit of background on XCEPT and some housekeeping. So, housekeeping. First, this event is being recorded and the recording will be made publicly available afterwards. Second, if you have any questions for our speakers today, please write them into the chat function on Zoom. And then during the Q&A, you won't be able to ask your question verbally, so you just need to write your question in there. And you can ask anonymously if you want. Finally, we'll be dropping an anonymous feedback form in the chat box towards the end of the event. If you have a couple of minutes free, we'd be grateful if you could fill it out. Now, just to give a quick introduction to XCEPT and to today's discussion. Next slide, please. So XCEPT is one of the UK government's flagship conflict research programmes, funded by UK International Development. As our name suggests, our focus is on conflict-affected borderlands and how conflicts connect across borders, and what that means for responding to conflict. Next slide, please. As you can see, we cover a very broad geography, all the way from the Sahel across Africa to the Middle East, and then to South and Southeast Asia. And we're always expanding into new regions too. On the left, you can see some of our core partners who are doing long-term research, but then we also bring on many more partners through the XCEPT Research Fund, which is our agile commissioning platform. Now in this XCEPT webinar series, next slide please, we're bringing together several of our XCEPT Research Fund awardees who have been thinking about better ways to respond to conflict and its transnational dimensions. They have each been doing research on multi-actor interventions in transnational conflict contexts. So these projects examine coalition, multilateral, coordinated interventions in Africa and the Middle East. They tackle a diverse set of themes: conflict, climate, gender, violent extremism, peacekeeping, using a range of tools, including mixed methods, field data collection, and, as we'll see today, machine learning. This is the second webinar in the series. To find out about the other events in the series, have a look on the XCEPT website or sign up to our newsletter. So today's discussion builds on some really cool research by our partners UN University, who've been crunching data across UN peace operations across several African countries to explore whether the makeup of the UN peacekeeping operation, who's included in it, has anything to do with its success or failure. The moderator for today is Chido Mutangadura, Senior Fellow at UNU's Centre for Policy Research. So I'll now hand over to Chido to explain the format and introduce the speakers. Over to you, Chido.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlie. Good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our audience. I myself am joining from Nairobi, and it is a very sunny late afternoon. Welcome to the XCEPT seminar, Diversity Among Peacekeepers, Who is Involved in UN Peace Support Operations and Why Does It Matter? Today's webinar comes at an eventful time for peace support operations. Three issues stand out for me. Firstly, the contestations surrounding the future of peace support operation deployment in the aftermath of the termination of the mission in Mali and the planned drawdown of the mission in DRC. Secondly, the proliferation of African military deployments, either under regional brigades or through bilateral agreements in countries that are already hosting UN peace support missions. Thirdly, after 15 years of debates, the UN Security Council and the African Union have finally reached an agreement in December on a framework for financing AU-led peace support operations. These security developments, among others, point to the possibility of new models of peace support missions emerging to address today's complex conflicts that often spill over borders, creating regional conflict systems. Today's seminar aims to contribute to discussions on the factors that make peace support missions effective, with the goal of providing recommendations to policymakers as they debate what future models of peace support operations will look like. The webinar is based on the findings of a study conducted by a team of researchers from the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, funded by the XCEPT program. The study used machine learning to examine the relationship between the demographic composition of UN peace support operations personnel and conflict dynamics in 4 case studies. So for these occasions, we have several speakers who will be taking us through the discussions. Firstly, our team of UNU Research Associates, Charlie Plum, Andrew Ham, and Kendall Gee, will take us through the PowerPoint presentation, followed by some initial questions to the research team. These questions will be answered by my colleagues, Eleanor Fournier-Tu, Eduardo Albrecht, and myself. Eleanor is a senior researcher at the UNUCPR and is the research lead for the UN's high-level advisory body on artificial intelligence. Eduardo is a senior fellow at the UNUCPR, and his research focuses on the uses of artificial intelligence in state and international organization decision-making. As Charlie already mentioned, my name is Chido Mtangadura-Yeswa, and I am a senior fellow with the UNUCPR, and I'll be moderating today's discussions as well as taking a question. After the questions from the panel, we'll be opening the floor to the audience. So let me hand over to our research associates for the opening presentation. So over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Charlie and Chido. My name is also Charlie. Andrew, Kendall, and I are excited to share some of the background and key findings in this research. So this project looked at the relative impact of features of mission composition of peacekeeping forces on the effectiveness of missions at peacekeeper diversity. So these include gender, region of origin, for example, if peacekeeping troops are from a neighboring country, a country in the region, or international, and status, so uniform versus civilian. And this composition may impact the effectiveness of operations in many ways. So for example, can a gender balanced deployment improve outcomes in different contexts? And if gender has an impact, how might it vary in nature or magnitude if women serve as uniformed troops compared to civilian operatives? So there's a host of questions that these sorts of overlaps suggest, but it's important to note that this research doesn't aim to answer those specific questions. Instead, it explores a new methodology to approach the issues and serves as a foundation for future tools and research into the topic, specifically a peacekeeper diversity index. So most literature on the subject has been conducted through traditional statistical methods, hypothesis testing, regression analysis, and that can produce really valuable insights. But this study aims to explore the utility of machine learning in the topic through use of a neural network, with insights from that data contextualized and understood through expert focus groups. And neural networks are really useful for this. They can learn to identify patterns directly from the data without testing any specific hypothesis, so they can uncover relationships that might not have been anticipated by researchers, so really enabling data-driven insights. They're really good also at modeling complex nonlinear relationships and handling huge amounts of data. So that makes scalability much easier. And if we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So to explore this methodology, our team collected historical data from UN Peace and Security Data Hub and from ACLID. To combine geo and time-specific peacekeeper diversity factors and conflict data. So you can see the 4 case studies analyzed, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Mali. And the next slide, please. And here you can see the input data from the UN Peace and Security Data Hub, and data from that our team extrapolated. So I'm not going to go over all of these, but you can kind of get an idea of the level of data fed into the model and different potential interactions that the model examined. And then next slide again, please. So here are just some visualizations of the conflict data under analysis. So you can see in each of these case studies, the blue line is the total number of armed conflict events. So it's all events occurring within the conflict geography. And then to examine those cross-border interactions and cross-border conflict, the red line is armed conflict events with foreign actors. So it's looking at events coming from foreign actors that occur inside the host country geography. And then if we can go to the next slide, I'll hand it over to Kendall.
Hi everyone. So the methodology for this project was conducted through a mixed method approach. So that means using quantitative and qualitative analysis. So in terms of quantitative analysis, data on armed conflict for the previous 12 months was fed into a neural network, and the model predicted the number of armed conflicts for the next 6 months with reasonable accuracy because we had that data. In order to test for different variable contributions, such as gender, status, and region, we used an approach in which we left out certain variable groups and saw how much the model's accuracy was impacted. So this gleaned results for 4 individual mission case studies. And if we go to the next slide, we can look at that. So the baseline for the comparison over the different UN mission case studies was when all 3 variables, which were gender, region, and status, were included in the model. So when one variable was removed, we could look at how the accuracy was impacted. For example, a positive percentage difference would indicate the importance of the variable in the model, whereas a negative change would indicate a negligible impact on the model's accuracy. For example, in figure 1A, which is on the top left-hand side, when the region demographic variable was removed, there was a positive change from the baseline for a region. This would indicate that this variable was contributing to the accuracy of the model. And then if we go to the next slide. Following the quantitative analysis, there was also a qualitative element. So the qualitative phase was used to stress test the credibility of the quantitative results, and it included a closed roundtable focus group discussion with expert participants from the UN policy community, so UN peace support missions and sub-regional organizations. So the roundtable was convened after the machine learning experiment to stress test this representativeness, and it was conducted on December 13th, 2023. Then I'll pass over to Andrew to discuss the findings.
We can go next slide, please. Right, so in order to evaluate the key findings from the study, we are looking at patterns or trends that are evident across all 4 case studies. To start, there were no demographic variables that had consistent impact across every case. This is to say that there is no variable that was significantly impacting the accuracy of the model to predict conflict across all 4 countries. But at the same time, there's no variable that did not have an impact in at least one case. This is to say that each variable did carry significance at one point or another. Second, the region of origin was found to be the only demographic variable that was identified as common in all 4 cases, which I will get to in a bit. And then lastly, to understand that as the most important variable, the impact must be interpreted within regional dynamics as well as international political dynamics. We can go next slide, please. And we can go one more. To unpack the first key finding, you can see in this slide, these tables represent the changes to the model when the variable is removed. Looking at the green sections, looking down the columns, you can see that there is no variable that shows green down in an entire column. At the same time, there is no variable where there is no green indicator at all. This indicates that each variable had significant impact, but not across every single case study. Looking at the next slide, please. Next, the region of origin was found to be the only common link. And if we go one more slide, you'll be able to see that here across the entire table, there's at least one significant impact through the region of origin. And this was found to be because the ability of peace mission officers, their language ability was really one of the key reasons that their effectiveness was determined. But at the same time, this was highlighted by the results of a youth survey by the UN Department of Peace Operations that included UN MISS staff. And this is where the focus group participants highlighted that the regional troops' ability to speak the language had a significant role in addressing climate change-driven conflicts. Lastly, language barriers were found to impede engagements on the other hand, showing that region of origin being linked to language was very important to the effectiveness of the operation. Next slide, please. And because region of origin has many factors involved, it's important to unpack these and understand which parts of this variable were influential. One more slide, please. So the findings of the study show that political dynamics were one of the key factors that limit the impact of region of origin. For example, when the range of national troops are under different command structures, things such as historical relations and neighboring country relations all impacted the ability of local forces to gain credibility as well as trust with the people that they're working with. And this all boiled down to the comparative advantage of neighboring troops who have similar region of origin being found in the ability to understand local language and the cultural norms that connect with the people that they are working with. One more slide, please. Lastly, we'll go into the policy implications of the study. And to start, we're seeing that personnel characteristics do have different impacts on peace support operation effectiveness, as well as their ability to influence the mission. Second, diversity indices, as we've evaluated, are all relevant factors, although there are no one variable that is the most profound, as well as the ability to influence each of the case studies. There are very important things to consider when considering diversity. And last, machine learning techniques can be used to unpack linkages between a variety of multilateral intervention characteristics. This study represents an exploratory approach to apply machine learning techniques, as well as the setting the grounds for future models that use similar techniques to unpack these linkages. At the end of the day, this study leads to the examination of a move towards the creation of a peacekeeper diversity index that may be useful within current debates or future of peacekeeping efforts. We can go to the next slide. Now we'll be moving over to questions regarding the experiment, and feel free to type some questions in the chat. I will pass it back over to you, Cheeto.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I realized my camera is off. Apologies for that. So thank you so much for that presentation. And I think before we go, we hand over questions to the audience just to get a little bit deeper into the presentation. I'd first want to direct a question to my colleague Eleanor, and I will ask you, in what way is this research relevant to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and more broadly, which aims to better understand the role of women in conflict and civilian protection?
Thank you very much, Cheeto, for your question, and thank you to colleagues for the very interesting presentation of the work. I wanted to provide a little bit of this kind of broader perspective of the meaning of this research. And as you mentioned, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a really important connection point here. The WPS, as many people here know, is a framework that was adopted first in the UN Security Council in the year 2000, which allows for a particular lens of analysis and intervention when it comes to conflict. And it has 4 pillars: prevention, participation, relief and recovery, and so on. And I think what it provides us what this does is to really connect the importance of really understanding contributions to peacekeeping and peace building from that diversity lens. So not only from the gender perspective, but also from another more granular lens. And you can see that there's a lot of potential for understanding, better understanding conflict response, and the effectiveness of peacekeeping operations by looking at things through that lens. Another item that I think is really important to raise is that right now we're in an era of understanding the impact of AI on peace and conflict globally, and a lot of the conversation has been around risks. And we can see here an example where it's harnessing or working on harnessing the opportunities of AI to better understand conflict and interventions related to peacekeeping. And so that shows us also the potential of predictive analytics and how important it is to invest in this domain to better understand things like patterns and success and interventions in peacekeeping. And I think the last point is how important it is to have a better representation when it comes to data collection. I think we were really lucky to partner with the UN here to have really relevant and important data. And we're going to talk more about the data platform and the data source in a little bit. In the last few weeks, we had the UN meeting at the UN Statistical Division, for example, and talking about how to better collect data. And I think that this example shows us that the more diverse and granular data we have around peacekeeping and around responses to conflict, and particularly cross-border conflict, the better we can understand what is happening, and the better we can tailor responses, and also do things like shaping peacekeeping forces, organizing, programming, and hopefully being more effective in addressing global conflict. So those are my thoughts in this domain. Thank you, Chito.
Okay, thank you very much, Eleanor. And what you just mentioned about, your third point on, how, this can be incorporated into methodologies and how it makes our research more credible, I think just sort of takes me back to, when we were developing the methodology for this research, and we decided that we're going to have, some considerations of, gender equality, social inclusion, considerations into the qualitative review, which we did in the focus group. And at that point, I think we really needed to have a qualitative perspective be brought into the research, because what we had in terms of quantitative information on gender was very basic. So we had the gender of uniformed troops, the gender of civilian personnel, whether they were male or female. We had, casualties desegregated by gender. But what we didn't have, once we started the discussions, was the realization that we didn't have things like data that desegregated at what were the roles that women were playing in the different peace missions that were our case studies. And so in the invitations, we tried to ensure that we had as many women in being in attendance to our group, but not just as women, but also people who were gender officers and had a very good understanding of how gender works in the different missions that they were deployed in. So as a result, our attendance for the focus group, we had 40% female attendance, which is about 5 women out of the 12 experts who attended. And through that, we're actually able to have a very good lens into understanding how, a peace mission such as MINUSCO has done very, very, very well in having women in influential decision-making. It also sort of gave us an insight into the evolution of a mission in Mali, whereas the gender unit started off struggling, and then it started to get more human resources and more financing, and how that then helped the evolution of the mission. And so I think this research for me really shows the ways in which we have this good interactions between quantitative data and then that role that qualitative data plays in ensuring that what we have represents what's happening in our research field. So I think as I finish off, I think I can go off if there are questions from the audience. This is now, opening. I'm going to be looking at the chat functions and just be directing questions, I think, to the different members in in the research group. And then I think I'll start off with, I see a question from Christian Ichite. I'm so sorry if I did not pronounce that correctly. And the question is, any findings on factors that could determine mission achievement of end state and closure? That is question number 1. And then we have a question from Lisa Kumalo. And she says, you mentioned personnel characteristics have different effects on peace operation effectiveness. Can you clarify more on this, especially which characteristics positively and negatively impact effectiveness? I just want to see if there is another question so that I can take 3. Okay, so I just have those 2 questions. Sorry, I also have another question from Christian. Women participation has been acknowledged in narratives as significant in the success of missions. Did the findings of this research affirm this, and to what extent? So those are the 3 questions. The first one being any of the findings on the factors that could determine the mission achievement, end state and closure. And then can we clarify more on the different effects of personnel characteristics in terms of which characteristics positively and impact effectiveness? And then that last question, sorry, I just want to scroll up to it and said, did our findings affirm this, sort of the narratives around women participation, and to what extent did this? So I don't know if Eduardo or Eleanor wants to take the question, or should I go for it?
Chido, thanks. I can maybe take question 2 and 3 to clarify the findings and the methodology. No, we don't, for question 2, no, we don't know what the effect is, if it's positive or negative. And this was only a very exploratory initial foray into the methodology and into this question. So at this stage, we only sought to see if there was some connection, but we don't know the nature of that connection. Perhaps in additional studies, we could do that. And then the second question about the impact of gender, I can maybe hand it over to Andrew, who was presenting the slide on the differential impact of different subsections of data in different case studies, in particularly the difference between experiments that included foreign actors and not foreign actors. Andrew, maybe can you bring that slide back up, because that would be a quick way for us to see which subset of data had an impact in which case study and what kind of conflict. Or maybe Poppy, I think you're the one in charge of the slides. Thank you very much, and Poppy. And it's the one right after. Yes, this one. Thanks. So here you can quickly at a glance see which indicator was connected to what case study and what type of conflict. So the green boxes indicate that when a variable is removed, the model's accuracy decreases. Therefore, it's important to the model. So just to quickly get your head around that, essentially green means that there's a connection, but we don't know what the connection is. So for gender data impact, we know that there is a connection in MINUSMA with foreign actors, so conflict involving foreign actors. That's the opposite is true in UNMIS, and while MONUSCO has gender as relevant in both types of conflict. So I hope that answers questions 2 and 3. I'm happy to hand it over to someone else for question 1.
Okay, thank you very much, Eduardo. So the first question was, any findings on factors that could determine mission achievement of end state and closure? I'm just going to have to ask you to clarify a little bit what you mean by achievement of end state and closure. Are you meaning in terms of, do you mean in terms of the conflict being resolved and the mission being being drawn down in light of in light of a resolved conflict. So just sorry, Christian, please quickly, if you can just sort of try for clarification, and then I can go for that question. I don't know if the audience members have any other question. I'm encouraging you to put your questions and your comments. So we do have a comment here from Andres, and he says, for some context, in terms of gender social norms require local women to be engaged by women peacekeepers, giving the peace support operations more latitude to build trust with community, gather needs from these women, and effectively support peace in the region. So this is actually something that our findings actually pointed to, was that it looks like from a qualitative sense, we were picking up that there's actually a connection between gender and region of origin. So having contingents who are both, women, especially in fields where we had, like, for example, in UNMISS, where there were like high levels of, sexual gender-based violence. So having women, but also women from neighboring countries who could speak the language of local people and effectively engage with them. So that is something that I can say we get that. We also had results that point to that. Okay, and so Christian has, thank you for your clarifications there. You meant the mandate of the missions. Missions last forever and get extended endlessly. Thank you very much, Christian. I think ultimately, when it comes to research on peace support operations, we also have to understand that peace is a political process. There really isn't a case study where a peace mission is going to come in and is going to create peace, which is why when you look at, deployment, the idea of peacekeeping, right? Where it used to be that you deploy the mission after a peace agreement has been signed in order to separate, and ensure that the conflict doesn't rise again. But what we're seeing is very complex, protracted conflicts that sort of seem to go through cycles where they're of de-escalation and escalation. And so that really then is why we were having this research, because there's so much discussions now on the question of what do we do? Because peace, mediation, peace building, all of these are actually political processes. They are not military processes. There is no military solution. I think at best is to support a peace and help it to sort of proliferate across the country. And I think the fact that we're seeing these peace missions that are deployed for extended periods of time just speaks to the complexity of the politics and the complexity of the conflicts themselves. We do have a bit more comments. Lizo Kumalo said, you demonstrated that region of origin ensures effectiveness, especially to the importance of language, but it also hampers effectiveness because of trust. So what would be the policy recommendation? What would the policy recommendation be for regional representation? So I think this is something that was in the research paper. I think I've spoken quite a bit. I'm very passionate about this project, so please forgive me. So I'm wondering, Eduardo, Eleanor, or I think our research associate, is there somebody who wants to sort of speak on this? I think on this sort of dynamic where regional representation can actually present as a challenge in terms of trust.
I'll let Eduardo chime in for this.
Yeah, thanks, Eleanor. That's a tough question, and I think the answer to that lies in the importance of the qualitative data and the limitations that we see with data science methods, because what we can evince from these experiments are always only partial representations of the truth. Whereas, especially when we participated, Chido, I remember in the focus group, we received much more nuanced and sophisticated understandings of how conflict dynamics occur. And I'd like to connect back to what you said at the beginning of today's talk, Chido, that these changes are occurring within a broader context that sees an increased participation of national militaries from regional countries working alongside UN peacekeeping troops. And UN peacekeeping troops themselves are seeing notable changes and reductions. So I think the only insight that we can take to the broader picture here is that it is important to pay attention to how the demographic composition is created. Now, what that demographic composition is and how it responds best to each conflict dynamic, particularly regional conflict dynamics, is going to be a case-by-case situation.
Okay, thank you. So I think this is actually a little bit of a sneak peek into the paper that will be coming out soon. It does actually speak about this. So when it comes to region of origin, what we see is contradictory. It literally depends on the case study country. And what I think the truth of the matter is in terms of region advice to policymakers, I would actually think that they've handled it very well. So what you often tend to see is, for example, when the East African community deployed into DRC, didn't have any Rwandan troops because of the challenges there. But Rwanda is the highest contributor to the troops in Central African Republic, and not only troops within MINUSCA, but also a bilateral force that works together with the Rwandan troops in MINUSCA. This is in Central African Republic. So the truth is regional policymakers and governments actually already have a good insight into the politics surrounding this deployment. And so I think it's just interesting to see how that evolves. I do see that my colleague Ayam has just joined the event. So Ayam Alme is the Information Management Officer with the Department of Peace Operations, Peace Building, Political Affairs in the UN. He leads on the Peace and Data Security Hub. So that is where we got, that very great quantitative data. And he has 7 years of experience in various policy planning and information management role across the UN peace and security pillars. And you are right on time to answer 2 questions on the methodology, because it looks like there's very interesting conversations coming up in the chat on the methodology that we used. So the first question is going to be, what types of data sets can be applied to similar models in the future to bolster the effectiveness of peacekeeping missions? And there is a request that you answer in layman's language. So over to you, Ayam. Hello, Ayam, can you hear me?
There we go. I just needed the host to unmute me. Thank you so much, Chidu, and thank you so much to all colleagues who are here. I've noticed a few faces, familiar faces from the United Nations Peace and Security Pillar. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to be very clear, the Peace and Security Data Hub provides the public with data, as well as anyone who is working on peace and security in-house can use the data, of course, but it is public-facing data from across the peace and security pillar. And we're just at the sort of cusp of the beginning of a data transformation within the peace and security pillar. And we will be looking at, over the next few years, to onboard additional data sets onto the peace and security data hub. The data sets that the teams have used have been monthly strength reports from missions. That is a publicly available data set. Countries who are contributing data to contributing troops to the UN, of course, would like to know which data sets, how many troops they have in various missions, and all that is compiled on a monthly basis. And I think that's at the core of the data that was made available to the research team. So we did a little bit of cleaning of that data in-house, something that we were planning to do anyway in the Peace and Security Data Hub team. And made that available to the research team. We don't take any stance on the methodology that the researchers have chosen to deploy, but just purely from a strategic institutional perspective of the peace and security pillar, I think this research kind of titillates at the potential future of what peace operations, what strategic asset peace operations actually have. peace operations are an extremely transparent force in the world. There is very facts and figures around how they're deployed, where they're deployed, how much funding goes towards it, and what they do is all readily available online. It's available on the Peace and Security Data Hub, but it's also available in the various Secretary General's reports. What we do in the Peace and Security Data Hub is just making that available, repackage that in structured data sets, and provide it to the public and researchers at large. And I think increasingly what we'll hopefully be seeing is that that's like a wealth of knowledge, a wealth of information that can inform anyone who wants to do peace operations in the future, but in particular future UN peace operations, to figure out what is the correct mix of constellation of resources, capabilities made available to the mission to implement its mandate. And I noticed that the research around peace operations has for many years, for good reason, been focused on how mandates are articulated or what goes into a mandate. So the upstream policy process, does peace operations with X mandate, are they more effective? And I think what the Peace and Security Data Hub enables researchers to do is to start answering questions of when there is something when X is in a mandate, what resources are made available to the peace operations to implement that mandate. That goes more towards the downstream implementation side of things. I'm hoping this will sort of enrich evidence and discussion around peace operations. But we are, as information management, only a humble data provider, not involved in what conclusions people might be able to draw from it. But do take note that it is a strategic asset to make our data and evidence available to the public. And I hope to bring that to bear in future collaborations as well. Thank you so much, Chido.
Okay, thank you so much, I'm going to direct a question to Eduardo, and then I'm going to direct a question to Eleanor. I think to you, Eduardo, I think I'd just appreciate if you could just take a moment to explain how the format of the data is something that was extremely important to us. I ask this because we've had two questions that is asking us, we've got a question from Adias who's asking us, what data did we wish we had when we were doing this research? And so sort of for you to bring in some of those discussions that we had in the early days of our research. And then after Eduardo, I'd like Eleanor for you to sort of have a bit of a discussion on the limitations. This is from Ruth, to speak about some of the limitations and successes of applying, this methodology and what would change in future iterations in order to deepen insights or findings for the purposes of informing program planners. I just had somebody sort of on the back end say, you teased us a little bit by, telling us that there's a link, but what is the link? So what would future iterations of this research look like? So first I ask you, Eduardo, to just explain a little bit about, velocity of information and things like that.
Okay, thank you, Chido. And I'll take both of them because Eleanor had to jump off to another call. So first on the format of the data, and yes, you're right, Chido, I have fond memories of how we wrangled with that. So while we are extremely grateful of the data that you provided, there was, and you know this, a process of data curation that occurred post-delivery. And that was probably the most intense portion of the research, because we wanted to make sure that we had a harmonization of data across the different case studies. So we wanted to make sure that we had the same time period. We wanted to make sure we had the same velocity of data, so at least monthly data points for every case study. And in fact, we did. And I have to say, I'm grateful for the fact that the data you provided was so exhaustive. Now, there was also a step of the process that involved curating the data from ACLID. ACLID, of course, you're all acquainted, certainly, and it's a great source of conflict data. And we were interested not only in conflict occurring in the nation per se, but also conflict occurring with cross-state actors. Now, that means that we had to go through ACLID data and tease out those conflict events that involved one or more cross-border actor. And we were obviously very happy to do that because that was the remit of our project. in fact, XCEPT's objective is to better understand the cross-border nature of conflict. Now, that process involved a very intense qualitative review of who the foreign actors are over a specific period of time. And as you can imagine, those change. And they have a proliferation of different names. They go by different terms. Sometimes they're splinter groups. So I have to say, I'm very grateful to Chido and her expertise, her domain knowledge, and her hard work in being able to create that filter and tease out those events that included foreign militias. And even the definition of foreign militia is no straightforward thing. So Chido, I was in awe at your skill in curating the conflict data set. About the limitations of the method, yes, there's plenty of limitations. The first, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, is that we don't know much about the nature of the connection between these variables and the dependent variable. So I wish we could have explored in more depth whether the correlation is positive, negative, the intensity of the correlation. And of course, there's a huge limitation in the fact that we only have two types of data, really. One is the peacekeeper data, and the second is conflict data. There are a host of other contextual factors that I'm sure you're all thinking about, and we thought about too as being incredibly important. These can range from, say, the trade in small arms to political indicators to more contextual aspects like maybe climate. So there's a host of things that were not included in this experiment and could and should, I think, be included in future iterations of this experiment. And finally, there was a point about how this feels like a teaser. And I'd like to caveat that all research is a teaser. Science is never a conclusive process. In that tradition, we did end with what I hope is an invitation to further investigate these findings and uncover what's going on with more research.
Okay, thanks. Sorry if I cut you off. Okay, thank you so much. In fact, one of the, just speaking in terms of the format of the data that we were saying, one of the sort of outcomes of the research we were hoping is to present this research as a case to other deploying bodies, such as the African Union, such as regional brigades, in terms of how they keep their data, right? So that we can actually have data ready, data repositories ready that can be put into this type of model, so that we have evidence-based, evidence-based policy making, knowing exactly what was the most effective elements of the East African community's deployment in DRC, so that this helps, as the next regional body SADC is going. So that's something that we're hoping that with machine learning, the big limitations is that we need data at a certain velocity. And in this case, we needed to have a data point for every month. And so we're also hoping that this is something that we can take, to colleagues in the African Union, to colleagues in SADC, to colleagues in ECOWAS and say, if you could keep your information, if you could keep data in this way, we would also be, as researchers, able to come in and help you using your own information. So let me go back to the discussion. And then Charlie Plum asked, how were the individuals in the focus group decided there? Are there other qualitative methods you'd like to integrate in future to analyze or understand quantitative results? Okay, so this goes to me. So I was, in charge of inviting people for the focus group. And so what we were hoping on, I gave an example for gender where I was not just looking for any woman or any man, we're looking for people who have information. So it was a closed expert roundtable. So our focus was on trying to identify people who could give us quality information, people who had a very good insight into the missions, into the peace mission. So some of the things that we had strategic planners, we had gender focal points. So it was really about the expertise, but also still taking, still taking that view on gender. And then we had Luga asking, in the case of the South Sudan, what are the cases of mandate success and failure? I don't know, is this something that you'd like to take, Eduardo, or should I go?
I think Ayam and you can take that one.
Okay, because I feel like I've been talking quite a bit as a moderator and also commenting on the side. But I think in the case of South Sudan, okay, let me hand over to Ayam if this is something that he wants to address.
Just to clarify one bit of information here, I don't think the research is making value judgments about whether the mission succeeded or failed in terms of its own mandate, but only whether it was effective in reducing conflicts in terms of output. So I just want to make that very clear. The evaluation of the mandate is not within the purview of this research collaboration. Would encourage anyone to take that forward and look at the mandate and define success and failure criteria that that they would agree with and conduct that research. I'm sure we'll be able to find willing partners inside the UN who would be happy to take that conversation forward as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Ayam. So as he mentioned, okay, so I do see that we've got quite a lot of interest on UNMISS. So as we mentioned, we were not, sort of specifically looking at sort of specific things, but it was from colleagues from UNMISS in the roundtable who were the ones who very strongly spoke about language as something that helped in their protection of civilians, the protection of civilians aspect of their mandate, and that was linked to the region of origin. And this is something that was influential when you look at the results that we got from the machine learning, was that region of origin was something that we picked out as being important in the case study. So that is where we had mentions of language. And I think this was amongst the, actually, I'm just going to have to sort of jog my memory. I think it was about having actually troops from Uganda speaking to some communities where they shared a language. So I think, let me go back. Are there any other, I'm just trying to see if I missed any comments. I encourage you to keep posting your comments and your questions to the group. So we do have Andre saying, thank you for responding. Those insights are gathered from our work in UNMISS. So the results make sense with what I see. Okay, and then Christian said that his point is the research may want to consider mission mandate alongside diversity in calculating mission success. We did have some conversations, and I think what we struggled to do was to find a database on mandates that had that monthly velocity that could give us information per month over the period of time of the research. But yeah, that is something that would be quite interesting to add. Charlie asked, what is the role of host governments in determining the composition of peace support operations in mission? Okay, Charlie, is there anybody who wants to take it?
I can take a couple of these, including Charlie's. I wanted to quickly also take Andres Peter's question about whether there were data sets we wish we had that would have been useful in this case. And Ayam, you'll remember that our initial conversations looked at budgets as well. We ended up not going there because there was some curation of the data that still had to be done, and there was some discrepancy with how frequent these budgets were available. But I do think that in general, budget data might be an interesting thing to explore beyond just the characteristics of the peacekeeping mission, because it does show where there's an investment that might have an impact on future developments. So if budget is allocated in month A, it might have an impact on month B and C and so forth. And it would be nice to connect and correlate that with the demographic data that we've had. Ayam, you have your hand up?
Yeah, just to speak to that, you said that one of the challenges is the velocity of data for this particular type of analysis, but I would like to just announce that we now have budget data available for all peacekeeping missions on the Peace and Security Data Hub. It took some time. We had to extract it from PDF documents, etc. But it is now available and ready for analysis. And you can look at the budget distribution along certain categories and subcategories, and use that as part of your. If you're doing a regression analysis or any type of machine learning that might not need as much as high velocity data, feel free to do it. We really do encourage researchers to explore these questions. In my view, there's also a big discrepancy between what budget is, the allocation amount or the troop allowance amount versus what is actually being deployed or actually being implemented. So expenditure versus budget, as well as the troop allowance versus actual deployment. And those are, not always the same thing. And the discrepancy between that between what is promised perhaps to the institution versus what is actually being implemented or being paid out might be an interesting factor to consider. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks. That's very exciting, Ayam. And we can continue that conversation about the budget data. To quickly address Charlie Plum's question about whether the role of host governments in determining the composition of missions might be useful, I'm going to hand this back over to Cheeto because she's the domain expert. But I would like to note, as the anthropologist on the call, I would even go into more granular detail and add maybe some kind of role for the individuals that are meant to be protected by the mission. So not just the governments, but also maybe local communities. To include those voices might be interesting from the perspective of how you go about putting together an effective PSO. But I'll hand it up to Cheeto, who is the domain expert on conflict.
Okay, thank you. So that was a question on the role of host governments in determining the composition of PSOs in missions. Thank you. So I have to be honest and say I'm not quite as familiar with the process as I should be. I do know that I think there has been for a while sort of, I think it is that countries do volunteer to deploy their troops on specific peace missions, if I'm not mistaken. And I think pretty frequently what you will find is outside from those those UN deployments, you find that with host governments now, for some, I think as the political dynamics have been evolving, where you look at DRC, where you look at Mali, where there is some tensions between the UN and the host government in terms of these deployments and their mandates, is that you're starting to see more and more these host governments go out and sign bilateral agreements. So with countries like Rwanda, to have them draw troops, and then under bilateral agreements, and then you also have them inviting in, some of these private security providers. So with host governments in the UN, if I'm not mistaken, it's normally that it's the troop contributing countries that do offer the deployments. And I think that being said, we are just a minute to ending the event. So I don't know if Eduardo, Ayam, Charlie, if any of you have any closing remarks that you would like to say. What I'm just going to confirm is that we are finalizing the paper. It will be out. We're looking forward to having it published and hearing your perspectives on the paper. So I don't know, Eduardo, would you have something that you wanted to say in closing? And then I think I'll hand it over to the XCEPT team.
Yes, I just wanted to say a big thank you to the XCEPT team, to Charlie de Rivaz, to Fareya Shah, to Ruth Citrin, and the help that they've provided in the process, both in guidance in terms of formulating the entire research, but also in various reviews of the research itself, the paper, the data. So a big thanks. We wouldn't have been able to do it without that partnership. And thanks to Ayam as well, of course, who's without whose data nothing would have been possible. So thanks to both of these partners.
I just want to say that, at least from the UN's perspective, again, we're at the cusp of a data transformation across the peace and security pillar. And I would encourage anyone who works on and about the UN to reach out to us and request data. Request the data that you need to conduct your research. It is not as closed off an institution as it needs to be. We can improve the transparency of our institutions, and we're happy to help. The Peace and Security Data Hub is there for the public, but is also frequently used internally. So please do reach out if there are other lines of research that you are interested in, if there's data that you feel is missing. And thanks again, of course, to Charlie and the XCEPT team for supporting UNU in this journey. Thank you.
Thanks, Siam. Thanks, Eduardo, Chido, and the whole team. Much appreciated, and a really interesting discussion. And I think most exciting is that there are many new avenues of research which can be which can be walked down through. This was just a taster, and it's kind of opened the door to a lot of new exciting journeys. So we're looking forward to that. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you hopefully at the next event as part of this series. Thanks a lot.